Right. The next session is titled The New Techno-Order, The Race to Rule the 21st Century Economy. And before we begin with the panel discussion, we have scene-setting remarks from Kushal Vadhavan, who is Manager, Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, India. And he is going to be providing context-setting remarks for India's digital public infrastructure models.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. At the outset, I would like to thank the ORF team as well as the Thabo Mbeki Foundation for organizing this Cape Town conversation at a very timely juncture. To begin with, it gives me immense pride to talk about India's digital public infrastructure as about 2 years back in 2023, when India started its G20 journey, the journey of its presidency of the G20, we had decided that digital public infrastructure is going to be one of our core priorities as a whole, as well as for our digital economy working group. And when we started discussing with the delegates during the initial DWG meetings, a lot of time was spent in terms of explaining what we precisely mean when we talk about digital public infrastructure. So a lot of the initial questions were around how this is different from e-governance, how is it different from various digital initiatives that governments are coming up with, and why does this need to be discussed as a concept of its own. And from there on, I think today we've reached a point where digital public infrastructure is not just a key agenda item in the G20. It's been carried forward by both the Brazilian presidency and the South African presidency, but it's become a key discussion item in all multilateral fora that is discussing the digital economy. It bears a specific section in the Global Digital Compact, and it's being discussed across BRICS, G20, and other multilateral fora. And I think that is because what we've come to realize today is that digital public infrastructure is not just a viable model for transforming public service delivery for developing economies, but it is a model for transforming public service delivery, governance, and open digital innovation for countries across the world, both emerging as well as developed. At its core, the digital public infrastructure philosophy is how do you balance open markets and open innovation with ensuring that every player has an equal opportunity to participate in the digital economy, and there is no creation of monopolies. So what we see is that there are three fundamental approaches to the digital public infrastructure thinking. One is that you give every player in the ecosystem an ability to identify themselves, and this is where the digital identity layer comes in. You give every player in the ecosystem an opportunity to transact, and that is where the payments layer comes in. And then you give every player in the ecosystem an opportunity to exchange information and data, and that is where the data exchange ecosystem comes in. So you have three foundational digital public infrastructure layers. They, of course, consist of identity, payments, and data exchange. And in India as well as across the world, what we've seen is where this has been implemented successfully, there has been immense benefits and immense transformation of how government-citizen interaction, digital innovation, and public service delivery have been transformed. Tying all these three layers together is an ecosystem that enables every participant to interact across these three layers. So in the context of digital health, for example, our National Digital Health Mission has a unified health interface. It's called UHI, or Unified Health Interface. It allows various data registries, such as registries on identification of doctors, health facilities, etc., to be discoverable by every participant, and to every participant be able to transact and avail services there, essentially eliminating middlemen. By by India's own experience in terms of how this has led to on-scale implementation, India's digital identity system today covers 99% of its population, and even more than that. That's 1.4 billion people that have access to a universal digital identity, Aadhaar. In terms of payments, our unified payment interface or UPI has reached about 20 billion transactions monthly in terms of volume, and in terms of value, this exceeds 2 trillion USD. And in terms of data exchange, we have this platform called the DigiLocker. It's essentially a digital wallet that contains in digital collaterals all your documents and information. And there are over 2,000 organizations that are using this for verified credentials and verified document exchange. There are over 600 million people who are using this daily. And in your phone today in India, you can carry all your verified national documents, your 10th certificate, your 12th standard certificate, your driving license, your digital identity, and you can use any digital device and these 3 foundational digital public infrastructure to transact, to exchange information, and to be able to do all this in a secure manner. What this has been able to do, we feel, is shape the Techno-Order in a way that we can see today that there isn't a trade-off that exists between moving towards open markets and open innovation, and at the same time ensuring that there isn't a lot of state control, there isn't a lot of control by a few private entities. India's payment landscape, for example, the foundational infrastructure, digital infrastructure, is of course provided by the government to democratize access. But the top innovation layer is all run by private companies. So one of the largest players in India's payment ecosystem today is Google Pay, for example. And what that tells us is that you don't need digital public infrastructure to be state-run. All you need for the state to do is ensure that it just democratizes these foundational elements, provides an interface on top of that, and on that private innovators come, innovate, and ensure that digital innovation happens in a way that ultimately benefits the consumers. So I look forward to the panel today, and I think the DPI conversation will continue as we see, hopefully, the US take on the G20 presidency and across other multilateral fora as well. We also have India hosting the AI Impact Summit next year in February, where we again see an opportunity to now take digital public infrastructure to the next level by integrating artificial intelligence into it and further streamlining how digital innovation happens. So looking forward to that and looking forward to the conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you, Kushal, for actually compressing a very complex and layered idea in about 6-7 minutes. So we're now going to move on to our discussion, and I'm going to announce the names of our speakers and request you to step up on stage. Lata Reddy, co-chairperson of Global Commission on Stability in Cyberspace, India. Alison Gilwald is Distinguished Fellow Emeritus, Research ICT Africa from South Africa. Christina Lunz, co-founder and CEO at the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy in Germany. Stephanie Diepeween, Senior Lecturer, Overseas Development Institute at the Netherlands. And this session will be moderated by Nidhi Singh, who is Senior Research Analyst at Carnegie, India. Over to you, Nidhi.
Hello. Okay, I'm audible. So good afternoon, everyone. We're here to talk about the new Techno-Order, the race to rule the 21st century economy. My name's Nidhi, and I'll be moderating the session today. So we're living through a moment of profound technological transformation, one that will fundamentally reshape how billions of people live and work and interact with their governments. But this isn't just a story about innovation. It's a story about power, about inclusion, and who gets to write the rules for the new digital age. There is a new tech order that's coming up, and it's being shaped by three fundamental forces. The first is the intensifying US-China technology rivalry. So this isn't just about a competition between countries anymore. It threatens to fracture global markets, it can splinter technical standards, and it can divide supply chains. The prospect of a balkanized digital world where different regions operate on incompatible systems is no longer theoretical. This is something that we're seeing as starting to happen. The second is that the European Union has positioned itself as the world's regulatory powerhouse. So despite lacking the tech giants of Shenzhen or of the Silicon Valley, the EU has become the global rule maker through frameworks like the GDPR, the Digital Services Act, the AI Act. So Brussels may not build the platforms, but increasingly we can see that it sets the terms on which it operates. And third, and perhaps the most interesting, which Kushal already talked about, is the emergence of alternative models like India's digital public infrastructure. So these models, they offer an alternative vision, one that is built on open, interoperable systems that are built they are designed explicitly for scale and inclusion. So before we get into the conversation, let's look at what's at stake. So whether this emerging techno-order is inclusive or exclusive is going to decide how billions of people access education, healthcare, and economic opportunities. But at the same time, there's also a gender dimension here. So women and marginalized groups are disproportionately affected by digital exclusion. They face a heightened risk of online violence and harassment. And they are typically very underrepresented in rooms where these technologies are being designed and where the policies that govern them are being written. So in that very cheerful context, let's start the panel today. So we'll do two really quick rounds of questions because I'd like to have some time for audience questions. So we'll start off really nice and simple with something that's easy, which is geopolitics. So on to you first, Lata. From a cybersecurity and stability perspective, how is the US-China tech rivalry reshaping the global digital landscape? Are we headed towards a fractured internet and separate technology ecosystems?
I think, as far as I'm concerned, there are ways to bypass being caught up in this rivalry. India has an independent position, and thanks to initiatives such as our digital public infrastructure, about which Kushal spoke at length, we can avoid heading towards such a fractured internet and separate ecosystems. I myself have served on two global commissions. Firstly, on the Carl Bildt Commission on the internet governance, and then later on, I was co-chair of the Global Commission on Stability of Cyberspace. Many of these issues have been considered there in these two commissions. And the emerging techno-order, which affects billions of people, as you say, and there is an element of gender discrimination for sure, because we are not in the driving seat, to put it mildly, the female population. In fact, I'm delighted to see that we're an all-women panel, which very rarely happens on technology panels. And I would like to ask for a round of applause for this initiative. Knowing Samir and his very strong views on gender equality, I'm sure that a lot of this is down to him. You know, as I said, I think there are ways to bypass this rivalry. And we can, in fact, you know, look at how we can innovatively bypass the inevitable fallout from this tech rivalry between these two huge powers in the tech world. And I think that what we need is a lot of innovation. We need new systems, new ways of being, new ways of thinking. And I think that is the way we can avoid getting caught up in this huge bilateral rivalry between the two powers. Thank you.
Thank you, Lata. Now I want to come to Alison. The US-China tech war, I think we've all heard about how it's framed as a battle for dominance. But what is your perspective on this? So do you think that Africa is being locked out of the technologies that will define the future, or do you think that this rivalry may bring some opportunities instead?
Thank you. Certainly we are locked out. I just want to kind of emphasize that that's not a new situation for Africa. That, Africa's long been the place where resources are collected, and there are very unequal power relations around that form of extraction, our participation in global supply chains, our ability to govern what happens in these areas of these new technologies. But I think what is very important now is the nature of this kind of what's often been called this new scramble for Africa, because I think it is very different. We are dealing in a situation where we're not looking at traditional sovereign states. We're looking at global players who dominate the market. And if we look at the kind of US-China rivalry, in fact, in terms of investments on the continent and what's happening on the continent, especially with US aid pulling out of many other areas, but in the digital area anyway for a long time, it's really the big tech companies and some of the big infrastructure providers that are players in the field. And then on the China side, it's more a sovereign state strategy where they are rolling out infrastructure. And very often infrastructure that's on a much bigger scale, really responding to local needs, moving very fast, but in both cases without a significant integrated, harmonized African framework in which this is done. So very often, part of this control of this new environment is actually that you control global standards, standard setting, these kinds of things that China's been very successful at doing. America's been inwardly focused and increasingly inwardly focused. I mean, if you look at the latest AI set from the US, looking very inward at what it's doing, so not really having much to talk to in terms of Africa. Whereas China's Shanghai statement was very much global cooperation. How do we work together to get AI servicing humanity and those kinds of things? So quite a switch there. So where does that put Africa? I mean, basically, what's not acknowledged in these, disruption of global value chains and the geopolitics and the geoeconomics, this weaponization of trade and tariffs and things in order to reach the national interests of these big players, is the fact that Africa is actually, a lot of this wealth, a lot of this dominance, total capitalization of AI, 75% across US and China, of global AI. So other countries also a little bit, marginalized in this process. But in the case of Africa, Africa is basically, the foundation on which a lot of this AI wealth and dominance and rivalry is taking place. So from the, extraction of mineral resources, the exploitative extraction of mineral resources, through to the extractive data, data extraction and labeling that's going on there, and multiple other forms, Africa's significantly contributing to the development and the and the profitability of AI and AI systems, but with very little compensation for that, very little beneficiation, many of the things that we've been talking about. On the other hand, as I said, 75% capitalization with China and US, that leaves a lot of other people out of the game, including countries like the European Union, or regions like the European Union. And obviously there is a way in which, leveraging their regulation in order to create better conditions for Africa in terms of minimizing, or at least managing the risks associated with our dependencies on big tech, especially in the context of DPI and stuff. So, there was a lot of talk about open systems and, an alternative path. But if you look at the, DPI stack in India, you still, the big companies are the big players, and they're funding a lot of the research behind this, and they're funding a lot of the rollout across the globe. So, again, it's very important that Africa understands these interests. It can leverage, some of these in its interests. But at the moment, in terms of what we're seeing sort of in the G20 outcomes, a lot of focus on the US because of its boycotting of the situation, but not a lot of attention paid to the really conservative pushback by the UK, by Germany, by the European Union on some of the gains of the digital transformation agenda over the last 3 or 4 years. But on the other hand, they're investing a lot, Europeans investing a lot into Africa. Again, much like previous investments, as I said, China quite unconditional, but problematic in the sense that with your infrastructure comes an ideological or a software thing. So, the problem with a lot of the infrastructure being rolled out currently is with it comes very heavy surveillance systems, for the merit system in China that comes free, gratis with your infrastructure package. And as a result, some of the most undemocratic, repressive regimes on the continent are the quickest to take up these technologies. And we will, until we actually, there's a lot of opportunities within the Continental Free Trade Area, within the African Union Digital Transformation Agenda, the AI strategy, these various things that would allow us to really take a coordinated, harmonized position on some of these investments. We would be able to play off some of these interests. But at the moment, it's very uncoordinated, and we're not actually leveraging the interest that countries have in getting spare resources or managing our labor inputs, etc.
Christina, let me bring you in here on the gender dimension. So how does the emerging order sort of intersect with gender equality and women's rights? What are the gender dimensions of this new techno-order that you think we should be looking at, which we clearly are not?
Thank you for the question, especially today on, I guess everyone knows, it's the International Day to End Male Violence Against Women today. And for me, one of the most relevant outcomes of last weekend's G20 was really the huge women's rights strike on the eve of the G20 here in South Africa, which led to the declaration of male violence against women in this country as a national disaster. It's a national disaster everywhere in the world. And when last night during the opening remarks here on the panel, we heard about that we're moving away from the rules-based order towards one which is based on strength and power, that really always means for those that historically have been deprived of power and that we are cementing exactly that. When strength counts, those that historically have been legally, economically, physically been deprived of the very freedoms that others in society are granted, then we have a huge problem. And especially with the developments of AI, what we're seeing is a cementing and scaling of misogyny around the world. To give one example, whenever there's talk about deepfakes and the danger of deepfakes for our society, most people, very often, they would think or talk actually about deepfakes using politicians, which could then in turn, consequently cause harm by putting words in their mouth which they didn't say. But the real problem with deepfakes is that 95% of deepfakes are non-consensual pornography, and 99% of those depict women. Women do not produce rape deepfakes about men. They're all produced by men about women. And what this leads to is that we're seeing a stark increase in the exclusion of women and other politically minorities from digital spaces, because it's never been easier to silence those voices. There are case studies, and my organization, we produced a couple of them earlier this year on gender disinformation. They are deliberately used to silence women politician candidates, women activists, women with a political opinion in the public. And it's really easy. Deepfakes apps can be downloaded by each of you and use a LinkedIn picture and you have your deep rape fake. And when we heard before about India and the public digital infrastructure there, in India, 2/3 of those on the internet are men, and only 1/3 are women. And we see this gender divide in internet usage around the world, but of course with different levels of the gap. So when also for the AI summit that is coming up, we desperately need to integrate a feminist, a gendered, a humanist, I guess, perspective that really takes into consideration the security needs of all people. If you do not do so, we will have yet another component that adds to the decline of democratic processes, because not everyone, first of all, can, it's a question of access, and dares to participate, because online misogyny is rampant, and it's likely to increase. I guess I'll leave it at here and take the rest for the second one.
Yeah. I think just sort of pulling on that thread of inclusion and exclusion, who gets consulted. So I'll come to you, Stephanie, because your research examines how digital technologies transform democratic politics and inclusion. So when we're looking at this new sort of emerging tech order, there's a lot of multilateral processes that are going into it. There's a lot of efforts being made to make it inclusive, but who is actually participating in shaping it? Are developing countries being consulted? Where are the decisions on this actually being made?
Thank you. Oh, good, this is on. Yeah, a big question, I think one that builds on what my panelists have already addressed. I want to take us back, though, in answering this question, just to think about the starting point and what we're talking about here. So when we start with a language, like a new techno-political order, there's some certain assumptions built into that I think are problematic and perhaps distract us from thinking then about the potential position of different countries, of the global majority, of the global south, in shaping our future. So the idea of a new techno-political order, one, it sort of assumes it's new. It assumes that it's ordered. There's a logic to it. And then in some ways it's sort of set. There's a direction there. There's sort of something that's established. We are entering a new age, as international relations scholars might like to talk about. But I want to propose that actually where we're at in this sort of transition globally to a new techno-political order, a new sort of intersection of technology, the application of science, and politics, is one, it's not just new. There's dimensions that are very familiar, even if they're distorted and being reshaped. And there's an element of chaos. It's not as ordered as we think it is. And there's three dimensions of that I want to highlight, and then sort of suggest what that means for countries of the global majority, global south, countries that are not in the sort of positions of power in our current political and economic world structure. So the first element in sort of thinking about what's going on, this sort of old, new, chaotic, ordered transition that we're in, is one that the playing field that's taking place on is uneven. That's not new, it's always been uneven, but we're seeing this concentration happen potentially in new ways, with huge amounts of investment going to particular countries for particular types of computing that just can't take place in most of the world. I am from Canada originally. Canada cannot participate in computing in the way that the US or China can, let alone South Africa, Kenya, the DRC, elsewhere in the world. So that unevenness is familiar, but it has a new dimension to it. The second sort of point which you raised that we're sort of seeing is who is involved. You sort of mentioned in the question who's being consulted, who are the actors that we're talking about in shaping this order. Well, one of the sort of obvious actors is that we are seeing these new few tech companies with a huge amount of resources, much more revenue than in comparison to many countries' GDP, being prominent. In a sense, the fact that they are tech companies and the nature that their technology plays within the structure of states, within the way that we interact with one another, from the personal to the political, that's new. But it's not new to have large tech companies central in global affairs. We don't have to go far back in history to see the role of companies like the British East Africa Company and other companies that play the role of states. So that's not new. So we don't need to sort of think that now we're in this age where the private sector is suddenly a key actor in global politics. It's always been there. It's always had a political role. And so we can sort of think about that and remember that as we're thinking about the position of then the countries of the global majority in this changing world. And the third one, and this is a point that Alison brought up that I think is really key to think about, is that especially countries in Africa are conveniently invisible within how we talk about this emerging order, but they're heavily integrated into what takes place, whether it's from mining, from data work, from people, researchers' ideas. Africa is part of that story, but it's convenient to particular companies, to particular countries, to devalue certain types of work, to ignore, to devalue, to hide what is going on in certain mining conditions in this continent. But that's also part of the story. So if those are sort of three dimensions of what's going on with this new order, what does that mean then for thinking about the position of, I don't know what to call it, developing countries, global majority, countries that were formerly colonized, the majority of the world that is often not sort of at the center of what's taking place in these global discussions? Well, first I would say we need to be realistic, that we are living in an uneven world, and it's an uneven world that has a deep, deep history. And second, I think we can look in that sort of deep unevenness as it is evolving with changing technology to something like a country like South Africa and what it takes to live and try to fight and move beyond huge injustices and inequality. It's a fight, it's a long-term fight, and it takes a lot of persistence, and it takes a lot of sacrifice. And it takes a lot of commitment and being the bigger man, but also being bigger person. Sorry, not man, especially on this panel. But to sort of step forward, and I think, President Mbeki, you know that fight and you know what it takes. This is not going to be handed to countries, but we need to think about what it looks like in an uneven world to step forward. And then finally, this is something that Samir mentioned in his opening remarks yesterday, is given this global order is not decided, there is an element of chaos. The tech companies are pushing ahead with a particular vision of intelligence, a particular idea of what progress looks like. That's not the only vision of progress that's possible, and I think that there has to be space for countries of the global majority to think about what is the vision we want from this changing order, and how do we think about it from our position to move forward. Stop.
Thank you. So I really do want to do a second round of questions, which means I'm going to be very strict with the time, and I will cut people off at 1 minute and 30 seconds now. So we'll do this quickly, because then we can open up to some questions from the audience. So I'm going to start with you this time, Alison. So we've talked a lot about multilateralism, which is why I want to come to this. So sort of the multilateral frameworks that have come up, do you think they genuinely enhance the digital equality and the data justice in Africa? Like, what are the prospects for regionalization, and how do you think that would position Africa better in the new Techno-Order? Again, just a reminder, 90 seconds for everybody.
That big question, you're going to have to cut me off. So I suppose there are a couple of important things. I think there's been a lot of commitment within BRICS, within G20, within South Africa's presidency of the G20 to multilateralism. But I do want to make the point that it's not unconditional. Multilateralism has not always served Africa well, and different kinds of multilateral institutions do so better than others. But even within institutions, there are different agendas running on those sorts of things. So I think, especially if you're looking at the multilateralism in the crisis that it's in the funding crisis that it's in, it's also very dependent on what is happening outside, what is happening in terms of the funding of multilateral institutions, who can, say what the agenda is going to be, the withdrawal of US funds and those kinds of things, but also very, very powerful influence and lobby of big tech in multilateral organizations. So a lot of the DPI agenda, a lot of the AI agenda is actually a big tech-sponsored agenda. And some of it, does fantastic stuff, but some of it is really undermining our interests, not serving our interests well. But because it's on offer, and in many African countries, that's all we've got. We've taken it, and the next time it's from somebody else, and those kinds of things. So I think we really need to understand what we want from multilateralism and demand it. But I think if you look at what's happened within the G20 process, as I said, there's been a real conservatism within it, within the failure to reflect. So, for example, on the AI task force, which was one of the critical mandates of this G20, the South Africa proposed looking at the entire AI ecosystem, from labor to green energy to thing. And there was complete pushback on that, on labor, on green energy, on things that are meant to be on the G20 or at least the G7's agenda that couldn't even be relied on to get to a ministerial declaration. So I think there's it really is a very complex but sort of multi-crisis issue at the moment, and just falling back on traditional kind of understandings of multilateralism and globalization and technology and things really require complete innovation and relook from a governance and policy point of view. Sorry, I can see you nodding.
Yeah. Christina, again to you, very simple question because we have 90 seconds to cover it. We've talked about the new Techno-Order and how that kind of like enables or amplifies a more online gender-based violence. So in 90 seconds, how do you ensure that that doesn't happen going forward? Like, what are the solutions for looking at how digital systems can be designed with these things in mind?
When we stop excluding those experts, there are plenty out there who are actually working on that. They're like whole organizations and commissions and boards of wonderful people, mostly women, but also men, who have all the expertise in the world to exactly tackle that. And once we stop excluding them from where laws are being drafted and where decisions are being made, then we can ensure that their knowledge actually gets into the policy making. Because last sentence, what I think we need to understand is that the huge part of that infrastructure is being built by what I would call the broligarchy, like the bros, the Musks and the Trumps and the Zuckerbergs and these guys who are very misogynist, not only since last year or before, but they have a history of misogyny. They're building, they're implementing, and these so-called strong men, obviously there's nothing strong about them, but these called strong men, they are building the infrastructure. So we cannot let that happen.
Thank you, Christina. Lata, on to you. Again, in 90 seconds, can you tell us what are the implications for smaller nations and developing countries that are being caught between these two superpowers as the new tech order emerges? So how do countries maintain strategic autonomy in an environment like this?
I think that it's not just the developing countries, but all countries can benefit from this. And the benefits, for say, of DPI are service delivery, economic participation, social inclusion, improved governance, bridging the digital divide, data protection, inclusivity, and a context-specific design, similar to roads, which provide us with a physical infrastructure to move goods around. And the foundation of a digital system is the backbone of modern societies. And UNDP does, in fact, actively support countries in designing their digital public infrastructure. And a well-designed digital identification system will have social benefits, voter registration, banking secure channels, inclusive, interoperable, and a governance system for public good, and better governance on the whole. So I hope I've kept to my time limit.
You have. Thank you so much. Stephanie, we'll close with you. So there's a gap of the promise of digital technologies and inclusion and what they actually look like on the ground. So when you look at, like, your work is across a lot of diverse contexts, what are the critical factors which determine whether digitalization actually enhances or undermines inclusion? So a very simple question that can clearly be answered in 90 seconds.
Okay, I'm watching the clock. So there's two things I just want to say, and then we can open it up to discussion for more. The first, inclusion doesn't happen as a side effect of efficiency. If your system or you're designing something for efficiency, it is not going to guarantee to be inclusive. A really great example of someone I spoke to about this was Transport for London in the UK, where their goal of digitalization was not efficiency, and they have kept cash as a key aspect of the system. And then the second, related to that, is that inclusion requires the right to not be included on your terms. And that needs to be meaningful. So if we don't have the right not to be included or not participate, and we're aiming for efficiency, we are not going to have inclusion. And I'll stop with that.
Thank you so much. With that, we are actually 40 seconds ahead of schedule, which is great. So we'll take some questions now. I'm going to ask people to please line up at the mics. Please introduce yourself. You may ask a question to one of the panelists or multiple panelists, but please be concise about it because I'd like to take multiple questions. Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you.
All right,
please.
thank you. So one important issue and dimension which was not covered by all of you is tech sovereignty. Tech sovereignty is very critical, and I'll tell you a small story. Earlier this year, Microsoft and SAP decided to cut off services to an Indian energy company. And you know why? Because they were doing business with Russia. Now, Indian government as a retaliation has decided, for example, only the officers will adopt domestic technology platforms. We are getting an alternative to WhatsApp, for example. But the point is, digital platforms are being weaponized. Any country in Africa which does not follow the agenda set by one of the Western powers can have Google or Microsoft or Amazon to suddenly cut off services. It's beyond geopolitics, it's a weaponization of something which we all use every day. Like all of us use Gmail. What if Gmail shuts you off tomorrow? So, when China created a gated tech ecosystem, everybody thought they were crazy. But today you see that they were actually wiser. India has an open system. Most of the other countries have open technology systems. So my question to you and the panel is, what do you do when Western technology, government powers, companies and governments come together to weaponize and use it in a very blunt word as blackmail?
Thank you. I think we'll take a couple of questions first, and then we can do this. Ma'am, you have a question? Could I ask you to introduce yourself first?
Yes. First of all, thank you very much for the panel and the discussion. My name is Bianca Bonetti, and I work in private equity investments. I worked a lot on the continent, so investing in early stage entrepreneurs, tech entrepreneurs actually. And I moderate a lot of tech events nowadays, so thank you for sharing your insightful thoughts. So my question, I think we've all tried to use ChatGPT in kind of like, how can I say, basically, if you ask ChatGPT, okay, make a photo of a CEO, ChatGPT will produce a male photo, right? So this is the algorithm. So I want to ask you a question about the algorithm. We talked about designing, we talked about inclusion, like how do we make sure, Stephanie said, we need to kind of like construct it as we're able to include everyone. But now let's talk from a tech perspective. How do we build the algorithm that it's including everyone? So this is my question for you. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Yes, ma'am, please.
Sorry. Working? Is this one working? Yes.
Yes.
My name is Antje Puschulte, and I'm from a federal government in Germany and working on digital policies. And I have also an AI question. In the beginning, when you talked about the Indian DPI system, you said the top layer, or the first speaker said the top layer would be innovators which use the infrastructure. And then you also said you would like to integrate AI in that. But the most AI that is integrated is foundation models, large language models. There are also other types of AI which are not so difficult to handle. But what will you do then? Would you integrate OpenAI or other players? We have in Europe only one foundation model, which is Mistral, but it's not a big player compared to the others we talked about. So are you planning to have an own foundation model? Is it possible for regions other than the US and China? And I think to the question she had before me, I think you cannot rule them and make them just because it's a statistical parrot. It's based on data, lots of data, but it will be difficult to make rail guards, or how you say that avoid this. And do you think you can take this AI tool for lots of things, or do you have ideas for what not to take and for maybe legislation or rules for it and where you cannot use it. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, ma'am, we can take one last question. I'm going to ask you to please keep it really crisp, and then we can come back to the panel to answer them.
Great, thank you very much. My question is to the panelists, but also a challenge to all of us. We've been talking a lot about what Microsoft is doing, what OpenAI is doing. How can we start talking about what African innovators are doing? To what she's saying, the reason why we are not represented in a lot of the models is because sometimes people like us are not building those models. So the AIs that we have represent the biases of the people who are building those models. So how can we make sure that Black people, for example, are represented? How can we make sure that women are represented enough that if you ask, can you create an image of a CEO, that at a point it will be an image of a woman, and possibly at a point it will be an image of a Black woman. So how can we invest in local, by local I mean Africa or Indian models, innovators, and how can we enhance technology on the continent such that people here can also be building those models? Because it might also be unfair to expect that someone sitting at, OpenAI who went to Stanford computer science class, which was primarily a male-dominated class, would be thinking about Lynette, a Kenyan woman from Africa, to be able to be represented. So inclusivity, but also how do we make sure that innovation is happening here? Thanks.
Thank you, ma'am. Can I ask you to just introduce yourself first?
Sorry, my name is Lynette Kwamboka. I am the Director for Data and Digital Transformation at Data Science Limited. Thanks.
Thank you, Lynette. I think we'll club these questions together. So we have two questions on inclusion and representation, one on sovereignty and one on DPI. So we can do this auction style. Whoever goes first gets to pick the question they'd like to answer.
DPI, sorry.
One on DPI, one on sovereignty, and two questions on inclusion. For sovereignty. Oh, yeah, please go ahead. You want to go ahead?
So I think that the issue of data sovereignty is absolutely critical, and I actually did have a little note here, but not time to speak about it. I think data has very clearly become a critical issue in international relations. Controlling the pipes has become the data pipes has become absolutely critical.
So it's tech sovereignty, not data sovereignty.
Yeah. So my point that I'm making is that your national sovereignty, traditional sovereignty, as it's been historically understood, is how we've organized states on a kind of Westphalian model. That doesn't work anymore, because actually your national sovereignty means nothing if you don't actually control or have the data or are able to process and use it. So I'm very specifically making this point because I think that is what is actually influencing international relations and global governance at the moment to counter the previous openness we had around data flows and stuff and the internet environment. As the internet, and internet governance become more fragmented, we've got big tech and AI have become more consolidated. And this really is just a few. Everybody's saying we did have big technology dominance before, but not in a way that you've only got 2 or 3 companies that are actually global monopolies and influencing such a portion of the economy. So the data sovereignty thing is absolutely critical, and I think it's very interesting watching the shift even from the G20, from the Indian G20 to this G20, where other countries which previously have not had data sovereignty on the agenda. If you look at the Europeans' position on DPI, the Pan-African European DPI, this is basically an industrial strategy on the basis of sovereignty issues within Europe as it competes in this global economy. So I think it's absolutely critical that one understands that it's the data and the power. We speak a lot about the compute technology, but unless you've got access to the data, that you're unable to shift that order, you're unable to shift those power asymmetries. And so the point that was made about getting African things, well, we're not going to do the foundational models, but we can develop using our own language, and we can't use the foundational models because, as she said, it is impossible to unbias them. That's why the governance framework of responsible and ethical AI doesn't redress the existing inequalities. If we've got 2/3 of the continent who aren't even digitalized, they're not going to come up in those algorithms and in the data sets that are being used by foundational models. And then that's exacerbated as you go to generative AI and other AI, where we're continuously excluded. And synthetic data doesn't solve the problem because you're replicating the same issues. So it becomes imperative that Africa actually gets the access to data, that is entitled to it. Some of that is our data, but that we also strategically use data on the continent to ensure that African researchers, African entrepreneurs, we have this in our African Union data policy framework. We need to open it up so that countries can use this effectively. And we have to demand the same kind of access that European researchers and European entrepreneurs have to the big data sets of those companies, and develop our local language modeling, which I think is a very exciting outcome of one of the G20 projects, is the development of local language modeling on the continent, which has a lot of solutions.
Thank you, Alison. I am cognizant we're out of time, but I would like to take 30 seconds for either Stephanie or Christina if somebody wants to come in on inclusion, or Lata if you'd like to come in on DPI. 30 seconds, I'm so sorry, we're out of time.
I think basically on inclusion, I'd like to address that problem because I think it's a really big issue. And I can only say that in India, inclusion has really worked. Because today when I see a woman holding a mobile phone who's doing what would be considered a very menial job, and she's able to communicate using that technology, that to me is wonderful. It is true inclusion. And I think that as we have more and more models of the excluded being included, we are going to see that women get their rightful place in the world. And on this optimistic note, I think we should end. And I think that this for me is the true meaning of inclusion.
Thank you. Thank you, Lata. Stephanie, 30 seconds to conclude.
I was going to say I don't think inclusion is possible, so I think maybe we should end on the positive note rather than me taking us down a more depressing one.
All right, and that brings us to a close. We are 1 minute over time, Sunena, but I think that's all right. So thank you, everybody, for the conversation today. And I would encourage everybody to keep this conversation going and pull on the different threads over coffee and lunch. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, speakers. Thank you, Nidhi. Very ably moderated, as well as the timekeeping. Before we move to the next session, perhaps you can step up to the front and get the photo.